Great. So thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon for our session on Maine and offshore wind. A discussion with Stephanie Watson, the offshore wind program manager for the Governor's Energy Office. We know that renewable energy is going to play a key part in achieving our climate goals here in Portland and across Maine. And we know that offshore wind is going to have to play a very significant role in meeting those objectives. So we're really happy to hear from Stephanie today to talk about the plans and the roadmap that's being developed by the Governor's Energy Office to help us get offshore wind established here in Maine. And so we're also joined this evening by Bill Needelman, who's our waterfront coordinator here in Portland, and he's going to say a few words as we get started about opportunities for offshore wind here in Portland and in the Port of Portland. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Bill.
Thank you, Troy, and thank you also to everybody who's attending. This is an area of, a topic of great interest to folks in the marine community as well as in the climate change community. I've had the pleasure of being able to serve on the offshore wind roadmap process that has been conducted by the Governor's Energy Office and led ably by Stephanie, who'll be speaking shortly. And I don't want to take away any of the time that she's going to be putting into this process. But what I did want to describe is the fact that the city of Portland has been a participant in this process right from the beginning, and it recognizes the two roles that the city has to play. One is we are a fishing community and a fishing port. And we share the concerns of the fishing community that offshore wind needs to be a responsible player in the Gulf of Maine. But we are also a port community, and we need to look to the opportunities of offshore wind as a port community and what this new industry may be able to provide in terms of business opportunities and our ability to participate in the development of this new industry. The Port of Portland has always been an energy port, and offshore wind is going to be a new source of energy, which will largely, hopefully, replace some of what we have, seen in petroleum products over the years. That business has already started to evolve and change and is smaller than the footprint that it used to hold. And so if we are going to remain an energy port, being a player in offshore wind is going to be an important part of our port strategy. While we do that, we need to keep our eyes on the fishing community and the fishing industry to make sure that we are smart enough and able enough to do both. And I really look forward to hearing Stephanie's presentation, and I'd be available for questions as well at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And as we get started and before we introduce Stephanie, I want to note that we do have the Q&A feature enabled. So as Stephanie makes her presentation, if questions spring to mind, feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat. And once Stephanie wraps up, I can help present some of the questions to both Stephanie and Bill, and we can hopefully get some answers to folks who are on the call today. And so again, I'll now look forward to hearing from Stephanie. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thanks, Troy, and thanks, Bill. It's nice to be here with the One Climate Future group. I've had the good fortune to work with Bill on the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap, and also to talk, I think, with the Portland Sustainability Committee a little while back. So enjoy talking with Troy and Bill. Bill is also serving on the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium, which is another activity that the Governor's Energy Office is involved in. So have a lot of intersections with Portland. Really glad to be here. I'm the Offshore Wind Program Manager for the state of Maine. I'm in the Governor's Energy Office. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about the climate and clean energy context of offshore wind first, and then to talk a little bit about offshore wind in general and where it's developing all over the world, then a little bit more closely and look at our part of the world here in Maine and the Gulf of Maine, and then talk about some opportunities for you all to stay engaged and to help us as we move a responsible offshore wind industry forward for the state. See if I can advance my slides. Hold on.
You're on mute now, Stephanie.
Okay. I'm in the office, and so I'm not at my home where I know where everything is. But this is a bit of a view of the sources of electricity for New England. And this is just to give us some context for why we need offshore wind. So you can see that we're heavily reliant upon natural gas as a source of our electricity. We are also, as a state, very heavily reliant on fossil fuels for our heating and our transportation in the state. This makes us pretty vulnerable to the price spikes that we've seen last winter. We spend about $4 billion a year out of state to import fossil fuels that continue to contribute to climate change throughout the state. That's a dynamic we really want to change. Last year, as you all know, in Portland, we had the second hottest year on record in the Gulf of Maine. Offshore wind is one of multiple renewable energy sources that we're looking to meet our climate and clean energy goals. And these are various goals and targets that we have throughout the state and in our laws. Our bipartisan legislature has passed these targets to help us achieve our climate and renewable energy goals. We are going to need a mix of renewable energy sources, as I mentioned, including offshore wind, onshore wind, solar, and paired with storage, so that we have the best mix that can meet the demands, the energy demands for the state at any given time. And if we look at the goals for other New England states with which we share the electricity grid, our need for offshore wind is even greater. We will need to double our electricity load by 2050 to meet these goals and to meet the beneficial electrification needs that we have to meet the climate and clean energy goals. And so we view offshore wind as one of those pieces of the puzzle to provide the solution. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what offshore wind is. So offshore wind is essentially wind turbines in the ocean. And there are a couple of different kinds. There are fixed bottom offshore wind turbines, and they're basically how they sound. They are fixed or drilled into the sea floor. These are similar to what you see on land, except they are much bigger and they have more complex supports that are drilled into the seafloor, and they are built to withstand the marine environment, which is very dynamic. The other type are floating offshore wind turbines. These are similar to the fixed turbines, except they have floating substructures that are attached to the seafloor with mooring lines and anchors. And so this picture is showing a project that has fixed offshore wind platforms and just pointing out a couple of the different components of an offshore wind turbine. Now, these are 12 megawatt turbines, which is about the range that turbines are going in the water right now. They are about 850 feet tall. They have blade lengths of about 350 feet. They are very, very large. A single turn of one turbine can power an average home for up to 2. It's very big infrastructure and very big electricity generation. So I mentioned that there are 2 different types of offshore wind platforms. There are the fixed, and there are a couple of examples of that on the left-hand side of the slide. These are appropriate for waters that are relatively shallow, so 60 meters deep or shallower. And then once you get above 60 meters depth, really need to move to floating. offshore wind turbines. So these are a couple of examples of floating substructures that are in use. So there are different designs. There are about 80 different designs, I guess, right now throughout the world. One of which is a semi-submersible that's on the right-hand side. The University of Maine has engineered a semi-submersible using concrete, which means it can be locally fabricated and manufactured. And they are one of the leading designs globally for floating offshore. This slide's just showing how a floating offshore wind farm really works. So you have an array of turbines placed out in the ocean, minimum of 20 miles offshore, and they are organized in an array to optimize the capture wind energy, but also to meet other requirements like navigation safety and environmentally sound anchoring to the seafloor. They have mooring lines that are connected to the seafloor. They also have cables in between. And there's a buried electric cable that connects the turbines to an offshore substation. And then the offshore substation itself also has a buried electric cable that brings the power offshore to the existing grid infrastructure. So this is actually an image that we took out of our Maine offshore wind roadmap, which we finished recently and published in February. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So offshore wind is real. It's more than 30 years old in parts of Europe. On the left-hand side, that's a picture of the first offshore wind farm that's ever been deployed. It was constructed in 1991 off the coast of Denmark. So there's a pretty long history there of that farm working, but also informing many other projects that have come afterwards. The middle picture shows the number of farms in Europe by country, and there are 40 offshore wind farms in the UK now, so they are one of the leaders in deploying offshore wind farms. China is also on the rise with more offshore wind farms, and they may overtake the UK in the next couple of years. On the right-hand side, you can see a recent screen capture of different offshore wind leases and projects that have been deployed in Northern Europe. So there's a lot of offshore winds all over the place. We've been working really hard to learn from the experience of these different farms deployed elsewhere to inform our process here in Maine and how we can have a responsible offshore wind industry.
Hi, Stephanie. Just sorry to interrupt for a moment. Sometimes the audio isn't awesome. I wonder if maybe you turn your camera off or something and reduce bandwidth, or
maybe I can do that.
or
Oh, well, now I'm jumping all over. I actually might try my headphones. See if this helps or hinders. Is that right?
try again.
Can you hear that?
Yeah, that's much better, Stephanie. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, so offshore wind is real. We have a number of projects demonstrated here. And then this is some pictures that I took off the coast of Norway. These are two floating offshore wind demonstration projects. The one on the left is a high wind demonstration project. It was deployed in 2009. And on the right-hand side is the Steedstill Spar floating buoy, floating platform that was deployed about 2 years ago, and both have done really well in terms of producing energy. They're grid connected to Norway, so people are benefiting from renewable power and the lessons learned. So looking at offshore wind globally, it's been deployed over 50 gigawatts worth in 2021. So this is a lot of power generation all over the world. And we have advancing offshore wind in many different countries, including China, Asia is really leading the way recently, but there are projects that are planned all over. In the United States, the Biden-Harris administration announced a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 to help us meet our national climate and clean energy targets. To meet that goal, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is the federal agency that's responsible for offshore wind planning and for leasing seafloor for both oil and gas and also renewable energy projects, released this roadmap for offshore wind to reach the 30 gigawatts by 2030. So they identified 7 lease areas that can help achieve this goal. The top few have already been leased. So the New York Bight area, the Carolina Long Bay area on the bar chart, and the Northern and Central California areas have all been leased. The Gulf of Mexico is up next, followed by the Central Atlantic and Oregon, with a offshore wind auction planned for the Gulf of Maine by 2025. So we are the last in this list. But we are also an important part of achieving the 30 gigawatts of renewable power from offshore wind by 2030. And this is a map of the different projects that are either planned or areas that have been leased on the East Coast of the United States. We also have a process starting in the Gulf of Maine, as I mentioned, with a goal to have the leases at the end of 2024. So you can see there are a lot of projects. 2 of these have already actually started construction, and those are Vineyard Wind, which you may have heard about, that they actually started installing the infrastructure on June 8th, so just last week. And these are some of the blades that arrived at the port of New Bedford in Massachusetts for that project. The vessel on the bottom is carrying the towers. And then on the right-hand side, that's for the South Fork project. So that's the second commercial offshore wind project in the United States. And that is the first American-built substation for an offshore wind project. And it's been constructed in Texas with workers from Texas and Kansas, and is being shipped up to New York for deployment soon. So the Gulf of Maine, we have a call area that BOEM has announced, and this is basically a planning area that they are winnowing down into much smaller lease areas over the next year or so. So we are still in a relatively large area here, shaded in green, and BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, asked for comments on this area and information so that they can provide a really informed decision about which areas to lease for commercial development. So to prepare for these auctions in the Gulf of Maine, and also for us to advance a responsible offshore wind industry in the state, the governor established the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative in 2019. And this initiative includes a number of different components, everything from planning and stakeholder engagement to research and innovation, policy, legislation, and then we rely really heavily on partnerships to do all of this work. We view offshore wind as an opportunity for Maine to not only meet our renewable energy and climate goals, but also to create jobs and economic growth in the state, including lots of families supporting careers. We're also committed to a responsible offshore wind industry. So as Bill mentioned, we need to balance the development of this new and additive industry to continuing to support our thriving marine economy, such as fisheries, aquaculture, et cetera. And we have the commitment to protect our environment, our wildlife and fisheries ecosystem in the Gulf of Maine, as well as preserving Maine's traditions and culture throughout the state. To help us achieve all of these goals, we had funding from the U.S. Economic Development Administration to develop the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap. So this was an 18-month process where we held stakeholder meetings and we had expert working groups on topics like fisheries, environment and wildlife, ports, supply chain and workforce, and renewable energy markets. Those working groups worked with consultants to come up with a number of different strategies and recommendations that we rolled into this roadmap over the 78 public meetings. And we had 96 working group members and advisory committee members in total helping us. We also brought in experts from elsewhere and consulted other technical studies from those other projects around the world. What we came up with is a roadmap with 5 key objectives, and those are across the center here. Everything from basically spanning those 4 working groups that I mentioned before, but also kind of adding a 5th component, which is to advance Maine-based innovation to compete in an emerging national and global offshore wind industry. So this is a pretty important piece of the state's economic development strategy that was published. It's a 10-year economic development strategy. It includes innovation, it includes offshore wind. So this plan that we are developing for the roadmap is also helping to achieve the goals of the statewide economic development plan, as well as these other really important objectives. On the right-hand side are some cross-cutting themes that are really important to a responsible offshore wind industry for Maine. And in addition to the 5 objectives, we had 26 strategies and 111 implementation actions that support all this work. In addition to the planning, I mentioned the research part. So we had, the state of Maine has proposed a floating offshore wind research array in federal waters of the Gulf of Maine. And that application is being considered by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management right now. We proposed up to 12 floating offshore wind turbines using the University of Maine's technology to produce up to 144 megawatts of renewable power over a 15.2 square mile area. And you can see the location of the preferred site that we submitted to BOEM. BOEM had recently put a notice of intent for an environmental assessment that the public was welcome to comment on and provide input to a future potential lease for this area. In addition, we have the State Offshore Wind Research Consortium. So this is an outcome of some legislation that passed in 2021. It was LD 1619 to support a responsible offshore wind industry. So the legislation outlines that the Governor's Energy Office should establish this research consortium to better understand the local and regional impacts of floating offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine. It also specified that we needed to include extensive representation from the fishing industry, ocean experts, and others to inform research priorities and fund some of that work. And also important for us to align with regional and national efforts so that we can leverage those efforts and those funding sources towards the benefits of the Gulf of Maine. So the overall goal of the consortium is to develop and execute a research strategy, basically to look at reducing the costs and potential impacts of floating offshore wind. As I mentioned before, Bill is on the advisory board for this consortium. We've had a couple of meetings to date, and we have a third one this coming Thursday from 9 to 12:30, and the public is welcome to join that. In terms of ways that you can be engaged, there's the stakeholder list for the Maine Offshore Wind Program. So that would be providing input to us on implementation of the roadmap, on the research array, and also on the research consortium. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management also has an intergovernmental renewable energy task force that we're part of, and they are seeking comments throughout their commercial offshore wind planning and leasing process. So you can sign up for that as well. And in terms of looking at the roadmap, I think it's really important for us to hear from you in terms of what you'd like to see your port facilities like. Bill has thought about this a lot, and Troy and others. Consider what kind of benefits you'd like offshore wind to bring to your communities of Portland and South Portland and others. And then maybe ways that you would be interested in supporting or attracting companies that can provide the services and supply chain needs to offshore wind to your communities. So there are a couple of ideas, but I'm happy to brainstorm with others on this call. And I think that's it. I was trying to keep it not too long.
Great.
Yep.
So thank you very much, Stephanie. Very comprehensive discussion. We do have a request to post the links that are shown in the presentation. But we will follow up with everyone who's registered and attended. Maybe can we share your slides, Stephanie, with the attendees, and
Sure.
and that will give some of those links. And I'm going to start off with, I have a question that maybe actually is both to Stephanie and Bill. In terms of one of the opportunities you mentioned earlier were jobs. So maybe you each could talk a little bit about what types of jobs offshore wind would bring to Maine and what opportunities that would have for different parts of the state. Maybe you start, Stephanie?
Sure, I can start with that. One of the studies that we had conducted for the roadmap was Maine offshore wind talent analysis. So basically looked at the skill sets and expertise that we have in our state already and where they might fit with the offshore wind industry. We are very strong in areas like environmental permitting and surveying, marine engineering, project development services, maritime industries. Obviously we have a lot of people with high competence of working offshore, great knowledge of the water. And then we also have a lot of skill sets in research and development, obviously. And then there are opportunities for people in construction to help actually construct the projects, particularly if they are with cement. We also have steel capabilities, especially working with secondary steel in the state. So all of those skill sets are really important for this industry at different phases of the projects. And the other thing I thought was really interesting about that study is that people are needed across the board, skill sets that vary, lots of different education levels and different topics. And so it really provides a lot of opportunities for a lot of people throughout our state.
Great. Thanks. How about Bill? What's your perspective on that?
So locally, port activity generates a lot of jobs already in marine construction and transportation. And the types of jobs that will gravitate to the Port of Portland, or may gravitate to the Port of Portland, will really be an offshoot of our existing port infrastructure. And then additionally, bringing in some of the project-specific tasks like survey in the lead up to construction. What we will not see in Portland is the development of the large scale fabrication facility. Portland is not well suited to be the place where these very large structures would be laid out and assembled. But we're very well suited to support the design, the survey, and then the ongoing maintenance and operation of these structures and facilities. And so we can envision that there would be warehousing, materials transport and transfer, crew transport. And we've already received interest from the industry on both public and private facilities and how they may find a home here in those future years where it will develop. We also think that there's, in the engineering and just the business support for a new industry, Portland as a service center will likely see a growth in employment in those aspects of the industry.
Great. So I have a question about there's like you mentioned there's the research array and there's like future BOEM leasing. So what is the state hoping to accomplish and learn from the research array?
Great question. We are hoping to learn a lot more about the floating technology and how it interacts with the Gulf of Maine environment, which is different than other places it's been deployed, and also with the existing users. We have obviously a huge and vitally important fishing industry here, so we need to better understand how the interactions between those things may occur and how to reduce the costs of floating offshore wind, given that it's more of an emerging technology. The research array will allow us to learn from that and also how to develop future projects in a cost-effective manner.
Yeah, Troy, I think it's really important that the state starts with an experiment, and it's a very large scale experiment. But in relationship to the total capacity of the Gulf to potentially produce energy, it's appropriate to start small, or smaller than just jumping in. We need to learn how fishing and floating offshore wind will interact. And what we learn with the research array should inform the siting and the permitting for what will be an ongoing industry in all likelihood. If the state chose not to participate in this activity, because BOEM is a federal agency, the industry will likely come to the Gulf of Maine anyway. But our participation gives us the best opportunity to influence how it develops next to, in the area of the Gulf of Maine, next to Maine. And it provides us our best opportunity to get the most benefit of the industry with the least amount of impacts.
Great, thanks for that. And also, you do have a request, maybe if Bill, if you could either be closer to your mic or turn your mic up a little bit so we can hear you slightly better. And we have a question from the audience, whether it's feasible to repurpose the long dormant oil tanks or the land around them on the South Portland waterfront. Is there a way to use that infrastructure to support drop sites or any way to support the industry? And would someone like Portland Pipeline or some of the other fossil fuel legacy industries consider transitioning to wind generation?
I'll take a swing at that, and Stephanie,
Sure.
please fill in.
Go ahead. Yep.
That's been a really interesting thought, and that many people have come to over the years, including myself. Right now, there isn't a proposal to either bring transmission into the Port of Portland or to repurpose petroleum infrastructure towards the industry. But this is just the very beginning. We have, and if the industry grows as anticipated to meet our energy needs, I think it is inevitable that those companies that are in the energy business will look to opportunity. And so while I don't know of any specific plans to repurpose petroleum infrastructure, I would encourage both the community of South Portland and those industries that are going to experience transition towards alternative energy to think about their assets and to think about how we as a community contribute towards a green energy future.
We have another question. It mentions that ocean wind power infrastructure can create artificial reef communities and opportunities for ocean-based aquaculture. And the questioner is asking if there are any plans to do research around this opportunity to enhance the Maine seafood industry, maybe even around the test array.
I think there's a potential for doing research like that. We have this research consortium that has a broad-based advisory board. There are members of the fishing community and fishing industry association leads on that. We'll all be working together to identify the different types of projects that we can do either at the research array or beyond, larger projects throughout the Gulf of Maine to understand better. So I think all of that is on the table still.
Yeah, certainly there's already been a discussion as to, what the impacts of these facilities might be on the ecology and how that may either intentionally or unintentionally impact and influence the behavior of the critters that we both, rely on for food, but also that we want to protect. And so right whale behaviors, the behaviors of, bringing essentially what might be coastal environments out into the offshore where they don't currently exist, and how that might either enhance or potentially, provide a negative impact on fisheries. These have to be part of the questions that we ask and hopefully get answers to, and that's why there is a research array as opposed to just a full-scale deployment.
And
So
if
go
I
ahead,
can,
Stephanie.
sorry, Troy, I was just going to say, if I can add a little bit, as we are designing the research array and the research consortium priorities, we are looking really closely at what other entities are doing. In the region, there are entities like the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance is focused a lot on fisheries interactions and offshore wind. And then there's the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative for offshore wind, looking at wildlife issues. And then there are entities like the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, and they look at a number of things, including different technology design, but also on reducing or promoting coexistence between existing ocean users and offshore wind. So we are really trying to leverage those opportunities and add on to it instead of duplicate their effort. We're looking at the pieces that we can add to and mostly focus on, the fact that we're looking at floating, and the Gulf of Maine really is our unique niche, but also trying to learn from the bigger picture of that other research ongoing elsewhere.
Great. I was going to kind of follow up a little bit on the question of how offshore wind may or may not impact fisheries. I know our fishing community has been very interested in this topic and engaged in conversations. And maybe you could touch a little bit on some of the conversations that your office has had with the fishing industry and how you're thinking about addressing some of the concerns they've raised.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, through citing the proposed research array and also through the Maine offshore wind roadmap process, we've had a lot of discussions with people in the fishing industry. I'd like to give a lot of credit to the people the fishing industry members and association leads that were on our working group for the roadmap, because that was 18 months of discussion about a topic that was pretty unsettling for them. But they were at the table and they came forward with a lot of really constructive recommendations on how we can advance a responsible offshore wind industry. I think they were also really clear that, we don't really want to see this, but if it's coming, then this is what we really want to see. So we have a lot of expertise from those working groups and the recommendations that we can advance as we move forward with offshore wind. And they were really informative and important to our process and continue to be.
Yeah, I think there's two really, really important points on that. One is that, I've been involved, with the offshore wind discussion now for a couple of years. There have always been fishermen and fishing industry representatives that have been present. And the folks that I've worked with have been asking the questions on how do we engage with the fishing community, and then working with that community very, I think, proactively. The second thing is you cannot underestimate how unpopular this is amongst the fishing community. Some folks do see this as an existential threat, and we need to take those concerns extremely seriously. And that's why we need to do as much learning as we can, both in advance of the research array, during the course of deployment and operation of research array, and then continue to do that work, working with BOEM. BOEM is working at a very, 2025 is not tomorrow. It feels like tomorrow.
Mm.
and the Gulf of Maine leasing, it is coming. And whether or not we participate as a community, as a state, we're going to be living with the fisheries impact of this into the future. So the more that we can learn now, and the better we engage with our fishing community now, the better our opportunities for influence will be moving forward.
Are there any lessons learned from Europe and the North Sea where maybe there's already some opportunities for fishing to interact with offshore wind, or is that a different kind of circumstance?
It's a great question. It's a little bit different, and their species are different. Their methods of fishing are sometimes different. They have been doing some trial, well, I guess trial fishing in one of the floating offshore wind demonstration projects off Scotland. I think they're starting to learn some lessons from that. Um, so I think there's some things that we can learn, but as many people in the fishing industry have told me, the Gulf of Maine is really special and unique, and we need to dedicate research and time and effort to understand that fully.
And that needs to be an important outcome of the research process, in learning how to do both. Seafood is low carbon protein and fat. It's part of our climate mitigation strategy is to rely more on ocean generated food than terrestrially generated food. And but at the same time, we can't make false choices. But the Gulf of Maine is a remarkable resource as a fishery, and it needs to continue to be so.
Great.
Fundamentally, I think the most important thing we can do is site these offshore wind farms in the best places possible to avoid conflict with fishing.
Fixed gear fisheries such as lobster will probably have an easier time than draggers and longliners, and there's different ways to fish, and that will be part of the learning that goes into this. And I'm not a fisherman. I don't have to go out there and risk my livelihood and risk my life in order to bring fish back to the table. And so we need to take their concerns extremely seriously.
So on a similar vein, certainly having wind turbines offshore interrupts navigation. So what kind of engagement have we had with the Coast Guard or other people who are navigating offshore?
Yeah, the Coast Guard is one of the other federal agencies that BOEM has to consult with to inform the siting of eventual commercial lease areas. So they are part of that process, part of the federal process for planning and leasing.
Great. And so just, I think we are wrapping up on questions, and so can we just refresh our memories on what's the timeline both for the research array, and then we mentioned the leasing starts in 2025. When would we start to expect potentially to see wind turbines? Well, I guess we wouldn't see them from here, but when would we find wind turbines off the coast of Maine?
We're hoping the research array advances quickly so that we could have a lease by the end of this year, and then construction and operation maybe the late 20s, 28 or so. And then I think commercial projects are going to be out later, more into the early 30s. So this is a long timeline, and it's although some parts of it, I think, to Bill's point, feel short, the eventual actual construction is quite a ways off.
I think it's
Takes
important to
years
note
to
that
permit and plan.
I think it's important to note that we've already seen benefits in the Port of Portland. There have been survey vessels that have tied up at the Maine State Pier and paying their pier revenues. The lead up to actual deployment will be busy, and there's going to be both impacts as well as potential benefits that come as part of that process.
And we do have another question came up in the Q&A. It was about birds, and The questioner wants to know if the governor's office or other agencies have been working with Audubon or other scientists concerning bird migration, because as we do know, the Gulf is a migration pattern for many migrating species.
Yes. So on our roadmap working group for environment and wildlife, we had experts from Maine Audubon, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Maine Department of Inland Fish and Wildlife, Biodiversity Research Institute, National Audubon. I'm sure I'm missing someone. I'm sorry about that. But we had a lot of expertise on that working group to help inform the recommendations in the roadmap. And they are also very active in our offshore wind research consortium and providing input to the research array. The Biodiversity Research Institute also has funding from BOEM to conduct some baseline digital aerial surveys of avian species. So there's a lot of work going on and a lot of expertise contributing to that aspect.
Great. So I don't see any more questions. I think we have covered a lot of ground. So again, thank you very much, Stephanie and Bill, for your contribution to the webinar and the great information you provided. And as I noted, we will definitely forward all of the slides and the links to all the folks who attended. And we will also be posting this on our website, on our YouTube channel. You also go to oneclimatefuture.org. It will be posted there. So we encourage you to, if you had friends or relatives or acquaintances who maybe weren't able to attend, let them know that they can catch up with it later. And again, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and best wishes for a great evening.
Thank you, Troy. and
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Stephanie.
Thanks for having me.